But let's go through the rest of it now to make sure you guys can apply this. Because honestly, very often, I mean, if we're being honest with each other, you're going to be interpreting confidence intervals more than calculating them in your careers and in your lives. You're going to be ingesting news, digesting news, maybe regurgitating news, who knows. But you're going to be dealing with news and data that's already been collected and having to look for truth or falsehood in it, rather than actually doing it yourself. I like to do both, but if we're being honest, we have to process things like unemployment rate jumps from 7.6% to 7.8%. That's a headline, an actual headline that there's a website called Headlines of a Mathematically Literate World. The better statement of that, of course, would be unemployment rate probably a little under 8%. Maybe rising or not, can't really tell. Doesn't have quite the same zing to it, but it's way more correct, yeah? It's way more correct. Such as this, okay? Oops, something there. There we go. This is the link for it in case you want to get to the website where all there's like about a half a dozen to a dozen he adds every couple weeks. Okay, so you may have seen this kind of a thing, where they compare something like, oh yeah, Star Wars in '99 with Darth Maul is so much better because it made so much more money than the original Episode 4 Star Wars made in 1977. And it did. It made $475 million versus $461. The problem is, as soon as you adjust that for inflation and other things like that, you realize that there are only 2 other movies in history that have amassed more gross than Star Wars Episode 4, Avatar and Titanic. That's it. Every other movie made doesn't come close to Star Wars Episode 4. Even with Mark Hamill's terrible acting. It's still, yeah.
It seems like there's a lot of times where you can just throw out a pretty blanket statement
Yes.
and hope that people will take it for as it is. How do we even know that adjusted for inflation is correct?
That's a very good question. We have to assume, and I've adjusted the numbers myself by using the government's inflation calculator.
I'm sure that's right.
Well, the thing is that it's replicated independently in different places. So then I go back to my redundancy statement is, what's the chance every single calculation is wrong? I have a hard time believing they're all wrong. Now, but Ben brings up a good point. We have to agree on a measurement. Before we can do anything, when you guys go to the store and buy a shirt, you buy a medium, put it on. You're trusting that a medium is a medium, right? You're trusting that we've got that measurement correct. Same thing for inflation. So I'm not saying it's 100% correct. I'm saying it's what we've agreed to, the rules we've agreed to play by. Is that fair?
Yeah.
No, it's a great question. And I'm not saying, it's what happens when we try to force rules onto an unenforceable world, so to speak. Yeah? So, but yeah, I love the criticism. Let's go back to some more headlines. Okay? Oops. No, headlines are later. I want to answer Rory and Connor's question first. We'll just go in order here. You guys in 243 saw this before. You saw this before. When you looked at the binomial distribution, we started by flipping coins and looking at coin flips, okay? So these are the graphs of histograms of coin flips if you keep flipping them more and more and more. What shape do you notice appearing?
Bell curve.
It's definitely a bell curve, even as, they're all discrete, right, Connor? These are all discrete. But as n gets larger and larger and larger, these things are shrinking down and occupying a more smooth shape. So now, if you take this off to infinity, which is, I hate even mentioning that without a calculus prereq in this course, but the idea of this course is so much of it is rooted in the idea of infinity and area under a curve. Take it off to infinity, it becomes a bell curve. The binomial degenerates, or whatever, into a bell curve. It becomes a smooth bell curve. So the idea is, as we head off to infinity, we can see that bell curve appear. But there's one big assumption that I made about all those bell curves that you just saw. Where was the bell curve centered? At 50%. That's a huge assumption. We didn't see any 50% up here, did we, today? I saw 7.4, I saw 9.2. What if we varied from 50%? So I decided to make a little exploration of that, okay? What if p varies? I'll start with a sample size of 20 and see what happens, okay? So I'll keep that sample size of 20 fixed. There's 0.5, and then eventually it's going to shift to 0.4, and then 0.3, and then 0.2, and then 0.1. What's happening to your gorgeous bell curve? What's happening to your gorgeous bell curve as the percentage? We're losing it. It's going away. Oh, it's my kind of last picture. When you're at 10%, which is still higher than the ones we had over here, it's gone. It's replaced with this skewed curve, right? with a very long tail over here. So now we go back to what Chris brought up about maybe an hour ago-ish. What if you increase the sample size now? Even with the skewed population, what if you increase the sample size? So I started playing with Excel. I said, okay, let's leave it at 10%, which is highly skewed, right? Highly skewed from 50%. But let's start sampling randomly more items from that population. So here's what happens. There's 20. Now what I'm doing down here is I'm calculating the average number of successes. Watch that, and watch the curve. What's happening to the curve? What's happening to the curve? Why am I smiling? Why is he smiling? Oh! Why? Say it again!
It's back.
It's back! Now I'm a little bit of a bastard. I am, right? Because there's something hidden in here, isn't there? Sample size is currently 100, right? If you look at this curve, it tops out at 20. Which means 21, 22, 23, 24, all the way down to 100 is down here. Right? There is more curve. So it's back-ish. The guts of it are back. The guts of it are back. How much is down here? How much is down here? Essentially, arguably nothing to worth worrying about. To tie in the chickens from 243, I'm sorry, I keep bringing the chickens back up, but they come in handy. 10% is the probability of getting a rooster when you buy a sexed pullet from High Desert Ranch and Home. Down there, this would be the number of roosters that you would get if you bought 100. Okay, so if you bought 100 roosters, you're going to expect 10. 10% of them should be. So that's the most likely outcome, right, is 10 roosters. 15's not that far away, neither is 5. But if 10% of the birds are roosters, are you going to expect 80 of 100 birds to be roosters? Would you expect 4 out of every 5 birds you buy to be roosters if only 10% are supposed to be? No, you wouldn't expect hardly anything down there, would you? So what we choose to do statistically is lop that part of the curve off and ignore it, because it shouldn't be there anyway. It's not likely to happen. It's too outlierish to even consider. And we focus on where the curve should be. Now Aaron's like, I don't like that very much. Good. Mathematically, that should make your stomach turn. No, there's something down there. Sure, there absolutely is. Much in the same way. Did I mention yesterday about that student that emailed me about the third gender possibility for the chickens? Right. When you consider it mathematically, it contributes 0.04% to the overriding total. I say ignore it. It's like worrying about flipping the coin and landing on its edge. It's like worrying about that likelihood. It's probably not going to happen, so don't worry about it. It's the opposite of what Dick Cheney used to do in government. Well, if there's a 1% of a 1% of a 1% chance of a terrorist attack happening, we have to act and spend billions on it right now. Okay, that's hard to refute from a public support point of view. It's easy to refute from a mathematical point of view. If there's a 1% of a 1% of a 1% chance of it happening, it's not going to happen. So you see, it's hard to convince America that that principle shouldn't be applied across the board. But mathematically, you can look at it and go, man, there's nothing down there. Ignore it. There's nothing down there. Let it go. So that's why we can. And that's why the smiley face is there. That's why the smiley face is there. Because we can look at this and our bell curve is back. So there we go. Connor, your question is answered, hopefully to your satisfaction, that as long as we get a large enough sample, our bell curve appears, regardless of how skewed the binomial might be. How large is large enough? Anybody thinking that? Or you probably might not even care at this point. You might not care how large, how good. So depending on where you read, which statistician you reference, and which textbook you got your nose in, I've seen 2 rules for large enough. Neither of them is sufficient, but you have to have at least, there's this thing in mathematics called necessary and sufficient. Necessary is bare minimum. You have to have at least this. Sufficient is, okay, now you got enough to make me happy. So it's kind of like Major League, movie Major League. You may have seen this movie years ago. There's a scene where not Tom Berenger. Not Tom Hanks. Was it Tom Berenger?
Tom Hanks.
It's Tom Berenger. It is Tom Berenger. He's the old catcher with the bad knees. And he walks into a party, and the party's people are very impressed because he's a Major League Baseball player at the party. And this one woman is obviously very infatuated with him, and she says, well, he must be very good. And he goes, I make the league minimum. That's necessary, making the minimum. So the worst, what do they call the guy that finishes last in his class at medical school? Doctor. Right? That's necessary. He passed medical school, passed the bare minimum. Necessary is you have to have the quantity n times p at least equal to 5 or n times p at least equal to 10. We'll come back to that throughout this course. That might not make a whole lot of sense right now. That's a bare minimum. I was checking that in the previous few slides as it was going. Notice right there, I was checking n times p, sample size times the assumed proportion, and then when it got above 5, all of a sudden the bell curve, oh crap, there's a bell curve. We're getting happy. We're getting happy. I was checking that for you. If you want more proof, I've got a mathematical proof of that on the website. You can ignore that too, and just trust me. I always appreciate it when you do, but I always assume you won't. You can check it out. But we'll come back to that later. What I want to focus on more than that restriction, though, because what you've noticed is when Gallup does a Gallup poll, do they sample 100 people? Do they sample 50 people? No, they sample like 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000. That's the sufficiency. Not necessary, but sufficient. They go well above necessary and get to what they consider to be sufficient. That's what I want to finish today talking about, is the sufficiency. Okay, so let's get in. Let's get in. Here's January 15th, 2014. Go ahead and read this Gallup. I think it's Gallup. It is. Check that out. Let's start the camera again, too.